Good evening, everyone. My name is Rabbi Alon Meltzer. I'm the Rabbi of Chadash Synagogue here in Sydney, Australia. And it is a pleasure to welcome first Rabbi Dr. Zev Eleff and people from Sydney and from around the world here on Zoom and on social media, on Facebook. It is nice to be doing this on Zoom and not having to venture out into the cold, as it is a frosty winter night. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we stand, the Bidjigal and Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. We are in the sixth of 8 incredible conversations focusing on the tradition volume of Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb. I thank tradition and especially Rabbi Jeffrey Sachs for the collaboration and the ability to produce and present this series. I thank Rabbi Dr. Eleff, or President Eleff, a good friend, someone who I haven't seen in a very long time, for joining us this morning, or his morning, our evening, for tonight's incredible talk. Rabbi Dr. Zev Eleff is the 12th president of Gratz College. He is one of the youngest, but possibly, is that really one of the youngest? Maybe even the youngest president of tertiary.
A few younger, yeah.
Okay, so one of the youngest presidents of a tertiary education provider in America. He is an incredible author, a scholar. He's written nine books. Or edited and written 9 books, more than 50 scholarly articles. He literally wrote the book on Modern Orthodoxy, one of my favorite books, partly because the first image in the book is actually a poster that I designed from a shidduch matchmaking course, but really just an incredible scholar. And tonight he's going to be talking about the synthesis between secular and Torah learning based on his article in the volume on Rabbi Lamb. And you can access that that article in the folder in your booking links. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to you, Rabbi, and at the end we'll have a conversation, maybe a few questions. Please put your questions in the chat, and we look forward to hearing your Torah this evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And of course, Rabbi Meltzer's creativity is just proving to be boundless, and his reach and the topics and how he brings people together. If this were a book, you'd be an anthologist. There's a lot of creativity in who you bring and how you curate things, and it's something to behold. Watching you from afar on social media, seeing things that you've done, only things that you can do. It's really, really amazing. Our business, I suppose, this evening is to really excavate Rabbi Lamb's, the synergistic blending, and Rabbi, really to understand how Rabbi Lamb's intellectual, that sounds too hoity-toity, but his theological, how Rabbi Lamb made sense of the world as a Jewish leader. And for that, Rabbi Lamb came to embrace terms. He would use a phrase, he would coin it, he would create it, and then fill it with meaning. And whether that was modern orthodoxy, as he described it, or he would change it to centrist orthodoxy, but all the while leveraging his training at Yeshiva University, falling deeply impassioned with the term Torah umada, Torah and science, Torah and wisdom, whatever that phrase might be. It's not exactly altogether clear, but that actually makes it more interesting. You could, if something's not clear, if something is vague, then it's up to the interpreter to decide how to leverage and use it. And Rabbi Lamb was a master of it. And so much of his legacy is an sometimes uneasy embrace of the thing that he is championing. And so this is really a history of that thing. And here's what I mean. Here's Rabbi Lamb in November 1976, and that was the topic, the immediate topic of my contribution to the tradition volume was Rabbi Lamb's investiture address. And but rather than the that article exists. What I want to do is offer fuller meaning and try to bring you along this journey of one of the most remarkable thinkers. Forget about modern Orthodox thinkers, or Jewish thinkers, one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century. Writes Rabbi Lamb in 2002. If the reader, this is a collection of his volumes, 70 Faces, 2 volumes, which is sort of the best hits of his writings and speeches. If the reader is perplexed by my use of the terms modern orthodoxy and centrist orthodoxy, the confusion is justified. The former term has been in use for some time to distinguish it from the Haredi, or more reclusive branch of orthodoxy. For a while, you can always tell if it's a bolded section. Here's the operative sentences. I rejected the title modern orthodoxy because I considered the adjective modern as objectionable. It appeared as if we were boasting of our modernity when indeed we were hardly uncritical of it, even though we stand for engaging it openly and forthrightly. I therefore introduced the term centrist, or I introduced centrist orthodoxy, intending not a mathematical mean, his background was in math and science, between 2 extremes, but those who follow Maimonides' principles of moderation. Maimonides, Aristotle, okay. However, this did not prove to be an inspired decision. Most people assumed it meant we were situating ourselves midway between Reform and the Satmar group. Nothing, of course, could be more wrong-headed. I have therefore reverted to the term modern orthodoxy. So it's a moving target, explains Rabbi Lamb. In 2002, when he is just about to leave his presidency of Yeshiva University, move on to chancellor, that last stage of his career. And he is testifying in a short introductory note that he embraced a modern orthodoxy, switched it, because only he was the arbiter of that community at that level. Centrist orthodoxy, uninspired decision, and so he moved back to modern orthodoxy. So what is all this? Well, there has to be a prehistory. Rabbi Lamb took advantage of the fact that modern orthodoxy had a very freighted history, contested one, but when he assumed, and we'll see this, when he assumed the mantle of modern orthodoxy, nobody was using it. It was in total disuse because nobody wanted to touch it with a 10-foot pole. Writes Rabbi Henry Pereira Mendez in the American Hebrew in 1898. Why 1898? Because Mendez was the founding president of the Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations of America and Canada, otherwise known as the Orthodox Union, the leading umbrella organization at that time in 1898, for many, many years later, of American Orthodoxy. And Mendez, who's the rabbi of Shereth Israel, the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue on the now Upper West Side, he writes an article, What is Orthodoxy? And he offers, well, maybe it's an enlightened orthodoxy. The word orthodox is misleading, he writes, but perhaps I want to introduce a term, modern orthodoxy, explains Rabbi Mendez. Well, Gottfried Deutsch, an important theologian and professor at the Hebrew Union College, which is the flagship seminary, still is, of Reform Judaism, he publishes an entire pamphlet called Modern Orthodoxy in light of Orthodox authorities. Says, Mendez, you and your fellows want to use this term modern orthodoxy? That's a contradiction in terms. What about Copernicus? What about all the other scientific wisdom that seemingly orthodoxy doesn't accept? And so he marshals, brilliant fellow is Professor Deutsch, all these scientific revolutions in which you have evidence that medieval scholars, Jewish scholars, Rashi, Maimonides, and the like, believed in a geocentric universe, not heliocentric, that is, or the sun is the center of the universe, and other areas in which spontaneous generation is another one. Orthodoxy, like all religions, have grappled with it and found a place for it. But at the time, he pointed out that there was a paucity of defense for it. How can you be modern Orthodox was the gist of Deutsch to Mendez. If you are Orthodox, sure, but anything but modern. Other people tried their hand at the term. This is actually, though, Mendes again, writing a letter in 1913. In the first 15 years, talk about an inspired decision. The Orthodox Union was nothing more than a paper organization. 1913, there was a nascent group around the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York that had been reinvigorated in 1902 with the arrival of Solomon Schechter as its president. It is an institution which eventually would call itself the center of conservative Judaism, but it wasn't altogether clear what it represented. After all, Mendes, who was also an important person within the seminary for many years, and Sabato Murray, as its president, used to refer to the seminary as a center of enlightened orthodoxy. So writes Mendes to one of the young leaders of the seminary, writes the following: Dr. Schechter and Rabbi Cohn have both had several interviews with me concerning the proposed Agudas Yeshurun, or Union of Promoting Traditional Judaism in America. Hard to market such a term. Don't even have characters to post that on Twitter. I have carefully examined the preamble to the Constitution and the sketch of the Constitution sent to me. I understand that you are chairman in Constitution Committee and therefore write you. So there is this organization that is in formation. It would eventually become the Rabbinical Assembly, the rabbinical organization of the conservative movement. And Mendes sees an opportunity to merge those preparations with the Orthodox Union. In order to explain my views to you, let us for a moment agree to the following definitions, even if they are not exactly correct. This is found in the American Jewish Archives, this letter. First, there is a group, this is sociological. There's a Russian Orthodoxy. This is the Orthodoxy which insists upon a certain ritual and certain forms, but objects to English sermons, has little or no decorum, fails to hold its young men and young women, refuses in its schools Hebrew and religious education to girls, and cares little whether women and girls attend religious service or not. It also insists upon customs as the shaitel, and in a word, degrades womanhood as you and I understand it. Women's issues is not a 1970s thing, you understand. There's a second group. He's back with it. Modern Orthodoxy, as represented by, for example, your and my congregation, several Ashkenaz congregations, such as those in Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Montreal. This orthodoxy, now this is how he's defining it, resists innovations such as organs, pews, meaning mixed pews, disuse of a talit, female voices in the choir, Christians in the choir. Then there's a thing called conservative Judaism. That's altogether unclear. Let this term mean the Judaism which permits some of the innovations named. Then you have Reform Judaism, in which additions to such innovations reject certain historical beliefs and aspirations, such as the Restoration, etc. So modern Orthodoxy is still being defined as what it is not. It's not being given full meaning. It's not altogether who it is. Well, in Boston, Massachusetts, the president of a newly established synagogue, Kilat Israel, still around today, looks exactly like this. They just built a new synagogue site in a suburb, the immediate first suburb of Boston. I was just there last week. Is Kilat Israel on Harvard Street, not Harvard. Harvard's in Cambridge. This is in Brookline, Massachusetts. Still, lots of things in Boston are named Harvard. Writes the president of the congregation. Could we get that bigger? Good. The problem of the seating arrangement, what are you talking about, at our temple was thoroughly debated at the meeting of February 25th and fought out with an Australian ballot in accordance with the petition signed by 7 members of good standing who demanded that such a vote be taken. The result of the vote is known to all. So there was an insurgency. There was an attempt to change the congregation. They've just moved in. We need mixed pews, says a small group. So fine, we'll take it to a vote. At first, when this question came up for the board meeting and members at large, I expressed my opinion and hoped that Kilat Israel would remain in every way an Orthodox congregation, meaning men and women sitting separately. And I had hoped that we would have a sufficient number of Jews in Brookline of the type that would support a strictly Orthodox synagogue. There were, however, an overwhelming majority of people who had given money toward the erection of the temple and who felt that this congregation should be what is called a modern Orthodox congregation. So Mendes notwithstanding, many had defined modern Orthodox as, well, we use an Orthodox Siddur prayer book. We use all of its rituals and ceremonies, but men and women fit together. That's modern Orthodox, is how they're defining it in 1925. And in fact, in 1928, we don't have the letter to Yeshiva University's placement director, but we have Samuel Czar's letter to Omaha, Nebraska. Trying to take you all over the United States this evening. Writes Czar to a congregation asking for help finding a rabbinic leader. Please advise my wire what you mean by modern Orthodox congregation. I'm on my left. Our graduates, while American-born, modern in the fullest sense. American-born means that they speak with a certain dialect and they deliver sermons in English, not in Yiddish, of the word. However, are strictly Orthodox. That language, again, we saw in Boston. Do you intend to have family pews in your synagogue? Strict Orthodox is orthodoxy with separate seating. Modern Orthodox is one where you have mixed seating. And in a prominent New York newspaper, the American Hebrew puts in an anonymous advertisement. This is exactly why. Prominent rabbi, forceful orator, remember, this is his own self-description. Successful organizer, well-known scholar, 43 years old, at present in charge of a large congregation in the South, would consider a change of pulpit. So he's putting himself out there, sort of. I'm available. Only conservative or modern Orthodox congregations desired. If you want me, write to the editor of the American Hebrew. So it seems like most people are picking up that by the 1920s, the difference between Orthodox or modern Orthodox and Orthodox, or what is modern Orthodox, is basically all the rituals, all the educational models, the same as you would expect in Orthodox, but you had men and women sitting together. Happy to send the slides to anybody who would like them, but to make sure we have the time to, so I'm eager to have a discussion about these sources. You had Rabbi Kutiel Greenwald in Columbus, Ohio, who too, in a volume which has nothing to do with theology, he leaves room in his introduction in Achlat Tzara, his work, about these pesky modern Orthodox rabbis, these young whippersnappers who call themselves modern Orthodox. They read this. He's offering more than just mixed pews. They read Spinoza and Schopenhauer and other such colleagues of theirs, and they move they have what's called a Friday evening service or a Friday evening lecture in the wintertime when people are working. They accommodate them by making sure they have late night service, which for many of the staunchly Orthodox was allowing people to work on Shabbos and get away with it. Continues forward. Other more ardently right-wing Orthodox critics claim that modern Orthodox is not to be accepted. Here is one critic from Brooklyn, New York, writing what I think is the very first SNEAS manual of a comportment of dress and behaviors for young ladies. Some girls may claim I shall join the X organization, yet I shall not yield to any temptation and shall painstakingly observe all the regulations, precaution measures, etc. In practice, however, she will hardly be able to live up to such a pledge. The mixed organizations, boys and girls together, and youth organizations, even if carrying, and we're already in the 1960s, you understand, even if carrying no ideologically wrong banner, it's not conservative. Now, by this time, conservative Judaism had planted itself, had formed itself. It was very clear what was conservative or modern Orthodox. They have to be avoided. Needless to say in this connection that there is no difference between a nationwide or even worldwide organization and between a local, say, synagogue youth organization. Here he's referring in coded language to in America we call NCSY, the modern Orthodox type in its American edition or its made in Israel equivalent, that's B'nai Akiva, are equally wrong from the Torah viewpoint. So there are critics on all sides of this thing that people are loosely calling modern orthodoxy. And in truth, here is a student letter in the pages of the Yeshiva College newspaper. The commentator writes, a young student, the term modern orthodoxy has severe connotations. We don't like it by the 1960s. It's bulloxed. It has freighted with too much challenging history. Let's not use it, say, that whole YU orbit. Writes Rabbi Yitz Greenberg today, who calls himself certainly modern orthodoxy. He and I have spoken about this text, actually. He defends himself when people call him modern orthodox. In pages of the Aguda Yisrael's Jewish Observer, finally, Rabbi Danziger speaks of orthodox modernists. Here is where he really fails to read me. The modernist assumes that modern culture is normative and the Torah must be cut to its measure. I reject this and am a severe critic of modern culture. And look at this parenthetical note. And of aspects of modern orthodoxy, a term which I detest. Nobody wants to own modern orthodoxy anymore. And even the Lamb family is totally unsure. Right, Rabbi Maurice Lamb, Rabbi Norman Lamb's very prominent younger brother. He was a rabbinical student at the time, writing in the alumni journal of the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary, the rabbinical school of Yeshiva University. It is a fact, we who consider ourselves quote unquote Orthodox are traditional in everything but name. The name Orthodox, he goes on to say, essentially, long dissertations say, let's be traditional Jews or just Jews. Forget about the term, the descriptor Orthodox, let alone modern Orthodox. Well, there were many letters to the editor, mostly saying to Rabbi Lamb, what are you doing? We worked so hard to establish this thing called orthodoxy, modern. Some people, but you're right, it's mostly in disuse. And one of the people who very carefully critiqued his brother was Rabbi Norman Lamb, a rabbi at the time in Springfield, Massachusetts. I thank the editor of Chabrusa, that was the name of the journal, for affording me the opportunity, offering several alternate ideas, and saying, look, I'd rather we just, maybe you're right, but practically speaking, we have to be Orthodox Jews. We can't change the nomenclature, the moniker, any one bit at this point, but modern orthodoxy is not on the table. Rabbi Lamb starts to make use of modern orthodoxy when he returns to New York to become the associate rabbi of the Jewish Center in Manhattan. And he starts in the late 1960s. He sees that, this is the end of what's called the day school movement from 1945 to 1965. American Orthodoxy isn't just reviving itself. Many predicted that it was just in a state of decay and would just be totally irrelevant and fall away to the wayside. But the day school movement creates a core group of young people who are maturing by the late 1960s. Many of them are now in college or have graduated, and Rabbi Lamb is spending much of his time ministering to that young cohort. It's a reminder is that change in American Orthodoxy, and I would say that this is the case for other enclaves as well. Certainly in Canada, what I know of Australia, of England, to some lessening, is that changes happen, but it happens bottom up. Young people are the most transformative element within Judaism. And Rabbi Lamb notices that in the late 1960s. Writes Rabbi Lamb in a sermon, Hanukkah time in 1968, we who are known for better or for worse as modern Orthodox, accept as both an integral, this is part of my mission, my mandate in this wonderful lecture project, as both an integral part of our Weltanschauung, right, our worldview, and as the basis for our community structure, the idea of uniting within ourselves two worlds, that of Judaism and that of the larger culture, the one that is expressed in Western civilization, its science and technology and humanities. Now, this is a major step. Modern Orthodoxy was leveraged earlier in the century as some sort of concession religiously, halakhically, right, a matter of Jewish law, to modernizing traditional Orthodox Judaism, that it could become acceptable to the rank and file in American Judaism. Rabbi Lamb has noticed by the 1960s, although and this is more of a rhetorical flair, I presume at this point, for better or for worse, he's the one who was embracing modern Orthodoxy. It's a certain posturing that he's very good at many, many things, which I think is born out of all of the speakers for the series. Is that Rabbi Lamb is now taking a term that nobody wanted to touch, certainly by the 1960s. Only the critics had mentioned this thing called modern Orthodoxy. Rabbi Lamb is ready to fill it up again with valuable meaningfulness. And it is that synergy between Torah and Western civilization, Western thought. You see Rabbi Lamb writing in an article in 1969, a year later, in the pages of the Orthodox Union Jewish Action, Modern Orthodoxy's Identity Crisis. Rightly or wrongly, again, uses this one, this is before we get to Rabbi Lamb. This is Rabbi Emmanuel Rachman, who is a little bit older than Rabbi Lamb. And he was described by Charles Liebman in 1969. Very important figure as Rabbi Rachman. Actually, they both vied for the same job as president of Yeshiva University in 1976. Rachman was considered to be the heir apparent, but controversial in many circles. And so Rabbi Lamb was the more moderate figure who took the position. Rightly or wrongly, writes Rabbi Rachman, one Jewish sociologist, he's referring to the great scholar Charles Liebman, had named me as an ideologist of modern Orthodoxy. However, one can hardly regard modern Orthodoxy as a movement. This is Rabbi Rachman. It is no more than a coterie of a score of rabbis in American Israel whose interpretations of the tradition have won the approval of Orthodox intellectuals who are knowledgeable in both Judaism and Western civilization. Okay, so they're a bunch of smart, well-educated rabbis. It doesn't mean they're part of a movement. None of the rabbis feels that he is articulating any position that cannot be supported by reference to authentic Jewish sources. None wants to organize a separate rabbinic body, and several have rejected an attempt to publish independent periodical because they did not want the remotest possibility that this would form a separate form of separatism, be interpreted as a schism of orthodoxy. I, no less than they, deny any claim to innovation. He says, I don't want it. I've been inappropriately tagged as the founder of a movement, writes in 1969, but the creation or articulation of shades and hues hardly warrants dignifying our effort with the term ideology or sect. I'm not the head of anything, Liebman. And this thing, I was on the editorial board, but I didn't even like the idea of this periodical that came out representing a new movement called Tradition. You got the wrong fellow, explains Rabbi Rachman to the world in the pages of an important journal at that time called Judaism. Rabbi Lamb, though, writing 2 months later in the pages of the Orthodox Union Jewish Life, he says, he writes now in full confidence, the challenge to our intellectual leadership is clear: to formulate the worldview of modern Orthodoxy in a manner, so this is how Rabbi Norman Lamb is defining his intellectual religious project, is halachically legitimate, philosophically persuasive, religiously inspiring, and personally convincing. It is a tall order, admittedly, but one which we must fill if the great centrist mass of American Orthodox Jews is not to be pulled apart in all directions. We need to have a center of gravity as they stagnate in impotence and inarticulateness for want of a clear world view, shita, to which they can feel fully committed in good conscience. By 1969, Rabbi Lamb said, you know what? Gosh darn it, I am the founder of this thing called modern Orthodoxy. Rabbi Rachman doesn't want it. I'll take the mantle. And he's noticed, no less than the Rosh Yeshiva of the Tel Yeshiva in Chicago, tells his own story about modern Orthodoxy and the dangers of it when he was being raised. Rabbi Keller was actually a Yeshiva College graduate, passed away, unfortunately, during the COVID pandemic. And he notices, and he tells the readers of the Aguda's Jewish Observer that there's something happening in these more modernist ranks. There's Rachman on the left, and thank goodness for Rabbi Norman Lamb that he is taking over. He is adopting this thing. A man like Rabbi Rachman represents what one might call the left wing of modern Orthodoxy, while Rabbi Norman Lamb, for instance, would stand very much on the right. And he quotes both articles that I showed you on the previous slide. Rabbi Lamb is all in a sermon delivered in 1972 in his final years. He'd be 3 years away from leaving the Jewish Center. This come home call on Yom Kippur, he's writing about this on Yom Kippur, is not writing this, he's delivering this sermon, is directed at each one of us. Now it is no secret. Remember, he was, for rightly or wrongly, was how he couched the language 3 or 4 years prior. Now it is no secret that I identify with what is called modern Orthodox Judaism. I have written about it, I advocate it, I defend it, I preach it. Does admit, but to you, my friends, who are within this camp of modern Orthodoxy, I confess my worries. Okay, I am troubled by emotional thinness and spiritual tininess. He said, look, no movement is perfect, but I worry about the spirituality of it all. What are we doing to protect ourselves from secularization? But by this time, Rabbi Lamb is totally bought in to being the leader of modern Orthodox Judaism. By the 1980s, though, that changes. Things flip very quickly in time. Some historians, like some scholars of like the Gaonic period, or the period of the Talmud, they trace change over 200 years. For us, with so many sources in modern Jewish history, sometimes you can track change by the year, by the decade. The RCA, Rabbinical Council of America, who sponsors tradition, thought it would be appropriate to bring this into our conversation. He delivers a speech in 1984, sort of a parting shot. He's stepping down from his leadership position, and he already is starting to use the term centrist orthodoxy. Many people are, as you saw on that first slide about Rabbi Lamb, about the accusations of what modern means. And Rabbi Lamb in 1986, as he had indicated in the opening of our discussion, he decides, you know what, it's time to change terms. After all, he brought it into being essentially, or repackaged it, reused it, recycled it. He can change it. By now, he is president of Yeshiva University. We seem to be suffering from a terminological identity crisis, right? In 1969, he published an article called Modern Orthodoxy's Identity Crisis. He's still on identity crisis. We now call ourselves centrist orthodoxy. There was a time not too long ago when we referred to ourselves as modern Orthodox. Others tell us that we should call ourselves simply Orthodox. Yeah, Rabbi Lamb in the pages of Charusa in 1960. This is very much a wonderful experiment that Rabbi Lamb is letting us all in on throughout the latter half of the 20th century, because terms do matter. I agree with the last view in principle, but shall defer to the advocates himself of centrist orthodoxy for two reasons. First, it is a waste of intellectual effort and precious time to argue about titles when there are many truly significant issues that clamor for our attention. In no way should the choice of one adjective over the other be invested with any substantive significance assumed to be a signal of ideological position. I humbly suggest, this is Rabbi Lamb now going a little bit back in time to the 1970s. I want to now that we look at Rabbi Lamb's trajectory of modern Orthodoxy, to centrist orthodoxy, let's take a look at Rabbi Lamb's speech, and we get it in full bloom. I humbly suggest, this is Rabbi Lamb in his investiture address, I humbly suggest that yeshiva universities distinctive philosophy of education has something of an enduring value to contribute in this particular dilemma, not only to the Jewish community, but to American society in general. It is perhaps worthwhile to summarize briefly what we regard as our distinctive mission. The guiding vision of this university, as it was formulated by my two distinguished predecessors, that's Rabbi Bernard Revel and Rabbi Samuel Belkin, was the philosophy of synthesis, the faith that the best of the heritage of Western civilization, the liberal arts and the sciences, was or could be made ultimately compatible with the sacred traditions of Jewish law and life, or at the least, that this dual program, with all its tensions, was crucial to the development of young Jews in an open society. The very name Yeshiva University symbolizes this article of faith. When Rabbi Lamb becomes president of Yeshiva University, he realizes that his discussion over what it means to harmonize Judaism with modern science and the humanities isn't just a Jewish thing. And it's not just an Orthodox thing. And it's just not narrowly a modern Orthodox thing. What Rabbi Lamb figures out by the time he accepts the position of president of Yeshiva University, has functionally left the pulpit, is that he can now find a new term. Torah umada is what he's referring to. Torah and science, Torah and humanities, whatever, however one defines mada. He can use that as his vehicle, and he can reach more people. It's not just that, but to American society in general. And in truth, by 2002, what Rabbi Lamb, that first slide that I shared with you about how Rabbi Lamb reflects on his use of these terms that are, again, his vehicle, his architecture to take along his mission, he realizes that maybe it's not a religious goal at all. And maybe it's a fool's errand or something maybe a little more gracious than that, to use terms like modern Orthodox or centrist Orthodox or just Jewish or Orthodox or whatever, to capture his religious attitude. Maybe that's not how it needs to be. Perhaps it could be done in an intellectual exercise. Eventually, Rabbi Lamb's mission moves from curating a faith community to a series. It doesn't mean he didn't identify with that community throughout his life. He certainly did. But Torah Umada and his presidency at Yeshiva University was meant to move his project from that of a small faith community to an expression of education, of text, of learning that could be useful for many more people, however and whatever they identify as. But all this can't be understood, certainly without the long history of how Rabbi Lamb understood the use of labels and whether there were at certain times that he was fond of using terms or not. He understood that terms do matter. Modern Orthodoxy, centrist Orthodoxy. And by the 1970s moving forward, truly it was Torah Umada in which Rabbi Lamb filled his religious project with the fullest meaning.
Yishar Koach, Rabbi Eleff. So incredibly fascinating to see that trajectory of Rabbi Lamb and to understand sort of his place within that story, or that tapestry of modern Orthodoxy. I'm going to open up to anyone who wants to put questions into the chat, but I want to start perhaps with a couple of questions. So Rabbi Lamb obviously really focused on the idea of modern Orthodoxy, and especially that idea of the Torah Umada, which was his manifesto, which we really understand as sort of the central ideology of what we now call modern Orthodoxy or open Orthodoxy, or whatever people want to engage with.
Whatever.
Can we just talk a bit about some of the sort of the praise and the pushback, not from the history, from the historical sources, or like from past, but like in those moments, who is backing Rabbi Lamb? Obviously, Yeshiva University hired him as the president. but it takes more than a ivory tower to create a movement.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. So it's really bottom up. It is not Rabbi Soloveitchik, not Rabbi Lamb. His most famous book is, as you point out, Torah Umada. His first academic book was Torah Lishma, which was a history, an intellectual history of the Eitz Chaim Yeshiva in Volozhin and its founder, Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin. And his advisor on the dissertation was none other than Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, who many of us refer to as the Rav. The Rav did not like terms. The Rav believed that he transcended. He didn't want to be limited by that. And so in terms of these projects that Rabbi Lamb had, Rabbi Soloveitchik was a poll star, but certainly not somebody who lent any currency to the immediate project of using these terms. Like, he once referred to modern orthodoxy in jest in 1962, but to my knowledge, never even bandied about the term Torah Umada. There were partners along the way, Rabbi Shlomo Riskin, back then known as Rabbi Stephen Riskin, and other young leaders at the time, the founders of Tradition. Rabbi Lamb was the founding editor, along with Rabbi Dr. Professor Marvin Fox, longtime professor of philosophy at Ohio State, then at Brandeis. And there were a few people, but nobody rose to the level of Rabbi Nolan Lamb. Rabbi Rachman was always, as you saw, didn't like the term and was in some ways Rabbi Lamb's opposition on the left. And he was deeply criticized. There is a famous, it's also in that book that you documents, is Gifter slaughters lamb for Passover before you went viral on YouTube. Perhaps it was Rabbi Mordechai Gifter, the Rosh Hashiva of Telz in Cleveland, a very powerful and influential rabbinic figure in America. In 1988, he delivers a lecture that is recorded on audio, not much video at the time, in 1988 at the Young Israel of Cleveland. And that tape gets a little label, Gifter slaughters lamb for Passover, quite clever, and it is passed around and duplicated, and many people know about it in 1988, 1989. Who supports him? Young people. He, through the Orthodox Union, through Yeshiva University, through the young people moving to the Upper West Side of Manhattan, recognized that they had a figure. He was a young man. He was in his early 40s, right? 1920, when he becomes the president of Yeshiva University. And he realizes that groundswell of support. He was a very important figure in the creation of an Orthodox network of college students called Yavne, supported by the Orthodox Union. He understood rabbis may or may not follow me, and some did. I don't want to, but his greatest champions were young people.
Rabbi Lamb came to Australia, I think 2, maybe even 3 times. I think predominantly as part of galvanizing Counterpoints, which was really quite instrumental here. But as Sarah, I think Sarah, but it might have been Geordie, her husband, but Sarah and I have had this conversation a few times. As Sarah and Geordie comment, this idea of modern orthodoxy moves beyond New York and the United States of America, really to being a global movement. Short of Rabbi Lamb visiting and preaching to communities, how did that transpire? Do you have any thoughts or knowledge?
Yeah. Well, Rabbi Lamb visits. He does go to Israel. Number one, Israel becomes a way station of ideas, and he speaks at an important conference of Ashkenaz and Sephardic synagogues, I think it was called. The yeshiva world was very upset because they were restarting the Sanhedrin. And Rav Gifter actually refuses to come at the time for that reason. Rabbi Lamb is the headline speaker at it. This is in 1968. Says, well, all this is happening. And he goes to Israel and he writes about young people. He speaks about young people. But it's a way station of ideas, Israel post-1967. And the Rabbanut and the chief rabbinate becomes altogether really important to Rav Unterman. And he also gets allies in the chief rabbinate, right? Emmanuel Jacobovitz, somebody who offers a new specialization of bioethics, which is right now, think about our modern Orthodox thinkers writing more about Aristotle and Chopin, or are they writing about bioethics? Many more people are writing about science right now. That's much more in vogue. Rabbi Jacobovitz is one of the people, Chief Rabbi Jacobovitz. He emerges as an important kind. He actually is he writes the Halachic column in tradition before Rabbi Bleich takes it over when Rabbi Jacobovitz leaves New York, Manhattan, for England. He's the one who is writing that review of halachic periodicals. So he's finding certain allies. And Rabbi Lamb, not surprised that Rabbi Lamb visits Australia, but Rabbi Lamb he visits South America. And that, that also has to be understood in pattern with what's going on in America, right? As part of that Cold War diplomat strategy of visiting and colonizing. And Americans think everybody should be like America, the greatest. Perhaps, I don't know of any great diplomat for America's causes in the late 20th century than Muhammad Ali and Michael Jordan. But short of that, Rabbi Lamb, not that he was intentionally copying this, but there was an attitude, almost an evangelism that was happening in America at large. And Rabbi Lamb finding co-champions throughout the world did make sense, but that happens because of post-1967 Israel. Everybody is finding their way
there. It's interesting that you note Rabbi Jacobovitz, because if we think about the United Kingdom today, and it has spilled into other areas, there is almost this shying away or moving away from the term modern orthodoxy again, and the movement itself. The United Kingdom and the United Synagogues are, they advocate themselves as traditional Orthodox communities and congregations. They're perhaps much more conservative, not just from the professional leadership and the lay leadership, but from the Amcha themselves. So it's just interesting to know that Rabbi Jacobovitz was, perhaps it was because he was, he established himself in some way within that New York scene, that he was able to sort of see the benefits of that.
He was. I think that's right. Rabbi Sachs, on the other hand, found no use. Also somebody who did not need a term to define him. Very early on in 1990, before he's chief rabbi, comes out against this term modern orthodoxy. He considers himself to be a student of Rabbi Norman Lamb, but he doesn't understand the use of the term. That has to do with rabbinic authority in England, I think. Right. Remember when the first chief rabbi in earnest is Chief Rabbi Nathan Adler, he decrees that there's only one rabbi in England and everybody else is a reader or a preacher, but I'm the only chief rabbi. I'm the only rabbi. Forget about chief rabbi. It's not like it is today. But I think that British attitude has expanded upon to all areas of the erstwhile Commonwealth. That is absolutely true. But when you have institutionalized, when you have the blurriness or the non-existence of barriers between church and state, means that you don't have to come out with labels, with designations. In America, where you have that separation, self-definition becomes all the more critical.
Right. And in fact, actually, Dr. Jonathan Erlich just sort of shared a question around the use of labels, and obviously in some moments that use of labels, that having an awareness of your identity is really important. Can you share a little bit about sort of some of the changes that we've seen in modern orthodoxy in the last, obviously it changes all the time, but it
does, about even by the decade. So I think that the most interesting thing that's happening is that rather than replacing modern with centrist and then with modern again, we've actually started to see, and one of my teachers, Sylvia Fishman, writes this in one of her books, about the existence now of both terms simultaneously. There's in a lot of these dissertations I noticed out of Azrieli Graduate School, for instance, and when they do really interesting anthropologies of Orthodox day schools, they will define some as centrist Orthodox. It usually means that boys and girls are separated. And modern Orthodox, again, sort of this 1920s, is where the boys and girls are learning Gemara together. But they are both risen to terms. What's interesting, I remember when we this other term, open orthodoxy, that exists, which is of course a term that's coined by Rabbi Avi Weiss in preparation to establish what is now Yeshivat Chovevei Torah. But when his successor takes over, he notices nobody's using modern orthodoxy. Let's grab it. So what's happened is that we have all these different terms have emerged, and that creates a fuzziness. It's a very academic term, fuzziness.
Yeah.
And now it's up to different people. And what's, I think, really interesting that happened is social media, right? Is now, it used to be that Rabbi Lamb was the custodian of young people's thoughts and ideas. And now anybody can tweet. Anybody can associate with, can grab followers on Twitter and on Facebook. Even LinkedIn is becoming quite controversial. And young people now are entitled to an opinion. They always entitled to an opinion, but now they have a platform to do it, right? The text that I showed you, and I purposely gave you the pagination of what to look for and zoomed in rather than type out the text and transcribe it. What Rabbi Lamb was offered is now being offered to many people, which is a wonderful thing. At the same time, it's hard to keep track. It's a whirlwind, and who's talking and their credentials. I try not to reveal that I'm an actual intellectual snob, but everybody has an opinion, and that's really fascinating for what that's doing for the conversation. That was easy for a historian like me, relatively easy, to pull in and find these sources and show all of you what were the texts that were floating around and well known, right? Even the Jewish Observer was paying attention to the Rachman-Lamb debate of the late 1960s. Now it's near impossible to track.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting point, and something that in my own research I'm focusing on at the moment. So it's very difficult in this social media world to really understand not just the macro and micro trends, but the way in which the seed's flowing. It's very difficult.
And Rabbi Lamb creating tradition in 1958 with Marvin Fox, the Fox and the Lamb, that's how they referred to themselves, was really was an attempt to actually, what's interesting is that Samuel Dreschner was the rabbi of the conservative synagogue in Springfield, Massachusetts, where Rabbi Lamb was, and he was also the editor of Conservative Judaism.
Huh.
So that also planted the idea, well, if they have one, I want one too. Rabbi Lamb was a very gifted writer, and founding tradition was an attempt to give voice to a group that didn't have an app. And so he was doing that on a much more narrow way in the late 1950s. And now it's totally exploded with opportunity. And then now it's a crowded marketplace of ideas.
Dr. Rabbi Alon, we talked about the rabbi is how I feel.
My mother named me Zev, yeah.
But I want to ask two questions, and I know I'm nearly out of time, but I have to ask. The first question really is, and part of it is just because I was, whilst you were talking, I was messaging Rabbi Dr. Ben Elton, the chief minister of the Great Synagogue, and we were talking about Rachman.
Yeah.
Because he made a comment once, and I said, based on that comment, I'm going to call you, and your description of Rabbi Rachman, I said, I'm going to call you the modern incarnate of Rabbi Rachman. And then I actually Googled Rabbi Rachman because I don't know enough about him. And then I took back the comment. But it's so interesting to me that a bunch of modern Orthodox or rabbis that came out of Yeshiva University sort of held leadership positions. You yourself got in trouble with Dr. Tova Lichtenstein about thinking about.
Yeah, don't play with people's history, right?
But it's so amazing to me that we have all these thinkers and incredible scholars in Rosh Yeshiva, etc., who went to Eretz Yisrael, who really helped develop Torah Mitzion effectively, and yet today there is such a divide between the modern Orthodoxy of the diaspora and the modern Orthodoxy Dati Leumi of the of Israel, and from an intellectual perspective, where they don't even know the Torah of each side. That to me is quite a shock.
It is. It really is. And right. So lesson number one is, if you want to write a counter history, what if JFK survived, or what if Rav Aaron had stayed in America? Make sure you do it many, many years after his family. She should live and be well. But we did do we did make up. And we did do a YouTube view together just when the pandemic had unfortunately set in.
She was here in I think 2018, 2019, and
yeah,
I started
that's like 20 years ago.
And we had a good laugh about the whole incident.
I still remember when I got the submission, boy, oh boy. But she remarked that the series that she stewards, the Motzer Harav series of her father's writings, is translated in Hebrew and is very popular in Israel. And one of her missions is to introduce her father, Rabbi Soloveitchik, Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, to a community in Israel that doesn't know him. You're absolutely right. After 1967, there is a flight to Israel, in which many young leaders are taking. We preach Zionism, so put your money where your mouth is. And Rav Lichtenstein is one of them. In 1970, 1971, accepts the invitation to become co-Rosh Hashiva of Yeshivat Har Etzion, the Gush. And that does change, and that was the point of my pesky article. I retired my Modern Orthodox Delorean, was how I wrote my postscript, like Marty McFly. And but that does happen. There is, by the 1980s, sort of, because this Modern Orthodox project is waning, many people are leaving in that next generation because they see more meaning in Israel. They are absolutely scaffolded, with different ideas. There's no question about it. Israel is a Rav Kook environment, is one that about the land has meaning. Torah va'avodah, and Torah umada is altogether different. And that has created certain barriers for conversation. Women's issues are radically different in Israel and America.
Thank you. And my last question really, I think, hopefully will sum up and provide us with some sort of aspirational thinking. We've touched on the development of Rabbi Lamb's thought, and sort of that support base of that young zeitgeist that was sort of growing out of the modern Orthodox day school system. Spoken about the differences and the changing sort of opinions around the use of modern Orthodoxy, and you mentioned Rabbi Sachs, and it's really incredible because Rabbi Sachs writes the afterword in the edition of Torah Umada, the sort of revised edition of Torah Umada. I think it was the 20th anniversary edition, and obviously, and obviously in the tradition volume, Rabbi Sachs is I think the afterword is included in full, and additional thoughts around Rabbi Sachs's our own thinking. We've got a cohort of younger people across the diaspora that are in some ways agitated. They have grown up in a postmodern sort of worldview, very much centered around some major social justice issues. But we've lost some of our greatest intellectuals and inspirational thinkers from within modern Orthodoxy. And it feels, at least from a leadership perspective, but I think also from that newly minted youth, that there is a vacuum, a leadership vacuum, a moral voice vacuum. And yes, Rabbi Lamb, as we've been discussing for the last 6 weeks, Rabbi Lamb's voice is timeless, but sometimes you need that human presence to deliver that voice. And as you said, it's not enough just to be on social media, because the social media is so quick, so fast, so short that you're not getting the same. You're just not getting the same impact. So yes. What's next? Who fills the void? What do young people do, and how does leadership respond? And don't throw any of your friends under the bus to who's
no. A very important philanthropist asked me a similar question about training. How do you create more Rabbi Lambs and Rabbi Sachses? And truth is, he saw in the sources in the 1960s, Rabbi Lamb Makom sheinish, right? There is nobody. I'm going to take it over. So the phenomenon of there's a vacuum of leadership, or a presumed one, that's perennial. It's always going to be filled with people. This idea that there aren't people who are thoughtful. I don't, not that you're saying this, but there's a general attitude of where, oh me, oh my, where are people going to come from? There are people. Here's the major difference: technology. Right? The book, I'm invested in books. There are a lot. These are not, this is not a Zoom. Yours is not a Zoom screen. Mine is not a Zoom screen. This is an outdated thing. Attention spans, because of technology, are different. And if there's a struggle right now, it is how, and this is all religious leaders, how to find and identify the appropriate vehicles to evangelize a mission, to bring back this conversation. That's what we're struggling with. There has never, ever been in our history such a rapid advance in media, between newspaper books to newspaper print to radio to television. All these were absolutely transformative. But what I just described took place over 70 years. Right? Facebook used to be a thing, and then Twitter said, forget about the level of high level posting. You just tweet it out. And Facebook and Twitter have brought down nations. It's amazing what has happened. We need to be able to find our footing to restart the conversation, because right now it's not a matter of do we have the ideas to help shape a new generation. It is, well, how the heck do we do it? It's no longer with a paper and pencil. It's, I don't know if when we catch up, it's going to be the keyboard.
Right. Yeah, it's very fast, very quick, and I think that's the challenge in the next, I think, 5 to 10 years is finding that response, and perhaps an opportunity for a further series around thinking about how we do it. Rabbi Dr. Zev Eleff, my dear friend, it has been incredible. It's incredible to hear your Torah, to hear your thoughts about Rabbi Alon. It's so good